4 men climbed onto a roof in Capernaum, and they began to take it apart. That is the scene, not a metaphor, not a turn of phrase. 4 men on somebody else's roof in daylight in front of a crowd digging. Dirt and broken reed and small stones falling into the room below, onto the heads of the people packed in there, onto the floor, onto whatever was stored along the walls. And nobody in the house stopped them. There were 4 of them, 1 at each corner of the mat, because a grown man on a stretcher is more than 2 people can carry up an outside stair. They had walked him there. They could not get him through the door, because the door was blocked by the crowd that had filled the room and spilled out into the street. So they went up. Mark says it in one plain sentence, with no astonishment in it at all. They uncovered the roof where he was, and when they had broken it up, they let down the bed wherein the sick of the palsy lay. That is the whole account of it. Mark does not think he is describing anything remarkable about the building. He is describing what 4 determined men did on an ordinary afternoon to an ordinary house. And that is exactly the thing worth slowing down over tonight. Because if you have ever pictured this story at all, you have probably pictured it wrongly, and the wrongness is not your fault. We hear roof, and we think of what is over our own heads: rafters, felt, slate, or tile, a sealed structure that a man with his bare hands could not open in an afternoon without a sore and a serious injury. The house was almost certainly Simon Peter's, a fisherman's house a few steps from the shore of the lake, and it was nothing like that at all. Understanding what it actually was does not make the story smaller. It makes it very much larger and much stranger and considerably more human, because it turns out that 4 men dug through the floor of the room where a family slept. So begin with what the village itself was made of, because the geology decides everything that follows. Capernaum sits on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee, on ground formed by old volcanic flows, and the stone lying about in the fields there is basalt. Black, hard, heavy, and awkward, it does not split into neat blocks the way limestone does. It comes out of the ground in lumps. So a Galilean village of that period was built of black fieldstone gathered from the surrounding land, stacked without proper mortar, with mud and small stones packed into the gaps to keep the wind out. The walls were often not much more than a meter high before they began to lean, and they were rarely truly straight. They could carry their own weight and very little else. That single fact settles the question of the roof before we even get to it. Walls like that cannot carry the weight of a stone vault, and they cannot carry the weight of fired clay tiles laid on a timber frame. Whatever went over the top of a house in Capernaum had to be light. If it had been heavy, the walls would have come down, and the family with them. Capernaum in the 1st century held perhaps 1,000 people, and it was not a grand place. There is no evidence of paved streets, no drainage, no public buildings of any distinction apart from the synagogue. It was a fishing village and a small customs post on a road, with houses growing outwards and sideways as families grew, 1 room at a time. Nazareth lay about 40 kilometers away by the roads. A person would actually walk up in the hills, and it was smaller still. The Galilee of the Gospels is a landscape of villages like these, close enough together to walk between in a morning, each of them a few dozen households of stone and mud, each of them poor by any standard we would recognize. Before the roof, 1 word about what a house like that stood on, because there is a parable hiding in it. In that country, The ground is not the same everywhere. In the valley bottoms and along the seasonal watercourses there is deep, soft alluvium, easy to dig, level, pleasant to build on, and dry as bone for 8 months of the year. Up on the shoulders of the hills there is bedrock, close under the surface, and cutting a footing into it is slow, hard, unrewarding work. A builder in a hurry, or a poor man building his own house in the weeks he could spare from the harvest, built on the soft ground. It is not stupidity. It is the sensible thing to do if you look at the site in August, when the wadi bed is a dry gravel path and the whole landscape looks permanent. Then the rains come. In Galilee they come suddenly, in quantity, and the dry watercourse that was a footpath in summer becomes a torrent within the hour. Water gets under a shallow footing and takes the soil out from beneath it, and a wall of stacked fieldstone with nothing binding it together does not survive that. It does not crack and lean, it falls. Which is the whole of the story about the wise and foolish builders, and it is a builder's observation rather than a preacher's. Both men built. Both houses looked the same on the day they were finished, and probably for several summers afterwards. The difference was entirely underground, entirely invisible, and entirely decisive, and it only ever showed up on the worst day of the year. Now the roof itself, which is the heart of it. A Galilean roof of this period was built from the bottom up in layers, and each layer is worth naming, because when Mark says they broke it up, these are the things they were breaking. First, beams. Timber was scarce and expensive in Galilee, so the beams were as few and as slender as the builder dared, often rough poles, laid across the shorter span of the room, resting on the tops of the walls. This was the costliest part of the house, and a family would have salvaged and reused those beams from an older building if they possibly could. Across the beams went a layer of smaller branches and reeds and thorny brush, laid close together to make a rough deck. Then a covering of matting or thatch. And then, over all of it, packed earth, mud mixed with straw and small stones, trodden and beaten down flat, sometimes with a thin skim of clay or lime plaster over the top to shed water. The finished roof was perhaps 30 centimeters thick, and it weighed a great deal, and it was never quite waterproof. The first heavy rain of the autumn found every weakness in it. So each year, before the rains, families went up and repacked the surface, and in many villages there was a stone roller kept for the purpose, rolled back and forth across the earth to compact it flat. That is the roof. Beams, brushwood, matting, mud, no nails, no tiles, nothing that has to be cut. A man with his hands and a small hoe could open a hole in it, and 4 men working together could open a hole big enough to lower a stretcher through in a matter of minutes, noisily, messily, and without doing any permanent structural harm at all. And it could be repaired the same way by the same men that same evening. Some fresh brush, some fresh earth, some water, and the roller. That detail matters more than it seems, and we will come back to it, because it changes the character of what those 4 men did. This was not vandalism. It was a mess, and it was rude, and it was fixable. Which means the roof was not the top of the house. It was the top floor of the house. This is the part that most reliably surprises people, and once you have it, a dozen passages of scripture rearrange themselves in your mind. A flat, packed earth roof, reached by an outside stair or a ladder along the wall, is usable space. It is dry underfoot in summer. It is level. It catches whatever breeze there is off the lake. It is, for a good part of the year, the most pleasant room in the building. So people slept up there in the hot months, spread out on mats under the stars, whole families together. They dried figs and grapes and flax up there. They stored things up there. They sat up there in the evening. They prayed up there. If you wanted to be alone in a house of 1 or 2 rooms shared with your parents and your children and your brother's family, the roof was where you went. The law had required a parapet on every new roof since Deuteronomy, and the wording of that requirement tells you exactly why. When thou buildest a new house, then thou shalt make a battlement for thy roof, that thou bring not blood upon thine house, if any man fall from thence. You do not legislate a safety rail for a surface nobody stands on. The rule exists because roofs were full of people. And you can hear it running underneath the Gospels once you know to listen for it. Peter goes up on the housetop to pray about the 6th hour, which is the middle of the day, and it is the natural place for a man to go to be by himself. What you hear whispered in the ear, says Jesus, proclaim from the housetops, an image that only works if a housetop is somewhere you can stand in view of the neighbors with your voice carrying. 3 or 4 households shared a single courtyard, and this is the second correction to make to the picture. The Galilean house was not a detached building, standing alone with its own front garden. It was 1 room or 2, opening onto an open yard that it shared with the rooms belonging to the rest of the family, a brother, a married son, an elderly parent. Archaeologists call that arrangement an insula, and it is what has been found at Capernaum. Clusters of small rooms built around irregular open courtyards, growing organically as families expanded, the whole cluster walled off from the lane outside with 1 entrance. A household in that world was not a nuclear family in a private box. It was a kin group sharing a yard. And the courtyard was where life actually happened. The oven was there, a beehive of clay, heated with brushwood and dung, shared between the families of the yard. The grindstone was there, and grinding grain was 2 women's work for an hour or more every single morning. Water was there in a cistern or in jars carried from the spring. The chickens were there. At night, so were the animals. Which is why so many of the parables are courtyard stories. The woman searching for her lost coin, the man knocking at midnight, the neighbors who come to rejoice with her when she finds it. These are not stories about isolated households. They are stories set in a shared yard, where everybody hears everything, and where a knock at the gate at midnight wakes not 1 family but 4. Water deserves its own moment, because nothing shapes a household's day more completely, and nothing is more invisible to us. There was no tap. Every drop used for drinking, cooking, washing, and the animals had to be carried in a jar on the head or the shoulder, from a spring or a well or a public fountain, and then carried back again the next day and the day after that. That job belonged to the women of the household, and it was done early, in company, at the coolest hour, which is why the woman who comes to a well alone at noon in John's Gospel is a detail every original reader would have registered instantly. Nobody drew water at noon by choice. She was avoiding the crowd, and the text does not need to say so. Where a village had no reliable spring, houses collected rainwater instead, running it off those flat packed earth roofs into a plastered cistern cut in the rock beneath the courtyard. A cistern that cracked lost the whole winter's supply slowly and silently through the summer, which is where the prophet's image of broken cisterns that can hold no water comes from. An agricultural disaster everyone in the audience had either suffered or feared. So a jar of water was not a small thing, and it took real labor to be standing there full. 6 stone jars of water at a wedding in Cana is a great deal of somebody's morning. A cup of cold water given to a stranger is a real gift out of a limited store. And a woman leaving her water jar behind at a well in the middle of a conversation is the ancient equivalent of walking out of your house and leaving the front door open. The rhythm of that yard is worth walking through slowly, because it is the rhythm of nearly every day of nearly every life in the Gospels. Grain was not bought as flour. It was bought or harvested as grain, stored in jars, and ground each morning on a rotary quern, 2 stone discs, the upper one turned by hand with a wooden peg, because flour does not keep well in that climate and bread was made fresh. It is heavy work, and it takes a long time, and it was usually done by 2 people sitting opposite one another, taking turns at the handle, which is the picture behind the saying about 2 women grinding at the mill. Then the dough, and a piece of yesterday's dough kept back as leaven, worked through the new batch until the whole of it rose, an image Jesus uses twice, and one that every woman listening had done with her own hands that morning. Then the oven in the yard, heated with brushwood and thorn and dried dung, because wood was too precious to burn casually. The bread was flat, baked quickly against the hot clay and eaten the same day. There was no larder of prepared food, no way of preserving a cooked meal, and no method of keeping anything cold. Which is what stands behind the plainest line in the prayer he taught them. Give us this day our daily bread, not a metaphor. A description of how the food supply worked. The evening meal was the real one, taken after the day's work in the cool, often in the courtyard, with everyone eating from shared dishes with bread rather than utensils. Which is why dipping in the same dish is such a loaded gesture at the Last Supper, and why sharing a table with someone was a public statement rather than a private courtesy. There is one more inhabitant of the house to account for, and leaving it out has quietly distorted one of the best-known scenes in Scripture. The animals lived indoors. A family of any means at all had a few sheep or goats, perhaps a donkey, and at night those animals were brought inside, into the yard if there was space, and in many houses into the lower end of the main room itself. The floor of that room was often built on 2 levels, a raised platform at one end where the family ate and slept, and a lower area, a step down, where the animals stood at night. It kept them from being stolen, kept them from wandering, and in winter it kept the room appreciably warmer. And cut into the edge of the raised platform, or built against it, was a feeding trough, so the animals could eat without coming up onto the family's floor. A manger, in other words, was not a piece of stable furniture. It was a fitting in an ordinary family room, exactly where you would expect to find one in a Galilean village house. Which puts the Nativity in a very different building from the one on the Christmas cards. The word usually translated in Luke's account of the birth is not the word he uses elsewhere for a commercial inn. It is the word for a guest room, the spare space a house kept for family and travelers, often the upper room. What the sentence most naturally says is that the guest room was full, and so the family were in the main room of the house with everybody else, and the baby was laid in the feeding trough because that is what was to hand. That is not a diminishment of the story. It is the opposite. It replaces a lonely stable behind a hostile inn with something far more like the truth of that world. A crowded family house, relatives sleeping on the floor, no space in the guest room, animals at the lower end, and a newborn put down in the safest hollow available. Now step through the doorway and let your eyes adjust, because the inside of the house is the part that our imaginations get most wrong. The doorway was low and narrow. A grown man stooped to get through it, and it was the only substantial opening in the wall. Windows, where they existed at all, were small square holes set high up, unglazed, shuttered with wood or cloth in cold weather, and their purpose was as much to let smoke out as to let light in. The walls were thick and dark stone. The floor was beaten earth, sometimes with a covering of basalt cobbles. So the interior of a Galilean house, in the middle of a bright Mediterranean afternoon, was dim. Not romantic candlelit dim, genuinely dark, dark enough that you would not see a small object on the floor without a light, and dark enough that a person coming in from outside would be blind for a moment while their eyes adjusted. Which is why the woman in the parable lights a lamp before she sweeps. Read that story again with a dark room in mind, and it stops being a slightly odd detail and becomes simply what you would do. Light a candle and sweep the house and seek diligently till she find it. She is not being dramatic. She has lost a silver coin on an uneven earth floor in a windowless room, and she cannot see it, and one small coin matters. The lamp itself was a shallow closed dish of fired clay, small enough to sit in the palm of your hand, with a hole in the top for filling and a pinched spout at one end for the wick. The wick was flax or twisted linen. The fuel was olive oil, which the household either pressed themselves or bought, and which was not cheap. A single filling of oil burned for something like 4 hours, with a flame about the size of the flame on a birthday candle. That is the entire lighting technology of the house. One small yellow point of light, set up on a shelf or a projecting stone or a wooden stand, throwing a circle of soft light and a great deal of moving shadow onto black stone walls. And this is why the lampstand sayings hit as hard as they do. Nobody lights a lamp and puts it under a bowl. Of course they do not. The lamp is the only light there is. It costs real money to run, and its whole purpose is to be raised up high enough that its small circle reaches the corners. Putting it under a vessel does not merely hide it. It smothers it and wastes the oil and leaves everybody in the dark. A house like that at night, with the lamp out, is dark in a way that most of us have never experienced. No streetlight. No glow on the horizon from a town 20 miles off. The doorway shut with a wooden bar. The family lying together on mats on the floor of one room, or up on the roof if the season allowed, with the animals in the lower part of the room or in the yard, breathing in the dark. Listen to the excuse the man inside the house makes in the parable of the friend who comes at midnight, and you can hear that room exactly. Trouble me not. The door is now shut, and my children are with me in bed. I cannot rise and give thee. It is not laziness. It is a bolted door, one room, a floor covered with sleeping children, and no light. To get up, he would have to find the lamp, find a coal still alive in the ashes, kindle it, cross a floor covered in people in the dark, unbar the door, and wake every one of them doing it. The parable is funnier and gentler than it looks, and it only works if you can see the room. There is one more room to mention, and it is the room in one of the best-known verses about prayer. When Jesus says to go into your inner room and shut the door and pray to your Father in secret, the word behind that is not a study or a private chapel. It is the storeroom, the small inner space where grain and oil and tools were kept, often the only part of the house with a door that actually closed and could be secured. That is a striking image once you know what the room was. The place recommended for private prayer is the pantry. Not because there is anything holy about a storeroom, but because in a house where everyone lives in one room and the roof is full of neighbors, it is the only door in the building that you can shut behind you. It is worth pausing on how little else was in that room, because it explains a line that we read past without noticing. There was no furniture in the sense we mean. No bedstead, no wardrobe, no chairs, no table of the kind that stands in a dining room. There were mats, rolled up and stacked against the wall by day and unrolled at night. There were storage jars. There were a few clay pots, a lamp or two, a hand mill, a basket, and the tools of whatever trade the household followed. So when Jesus tells the paralyzed man to take up his bed and walk, the instruction is not the comic impossibility it sounds like in English. The bed is a straw-stuffed mat and a blanket. It is the kind of thing a healthy man rolls under one arm without thinking about it. The command is not, carry your furniture out of here. It is, pick up the bedding you have been lying on for years and take it home yourself. And the same lightness explains how a household could move, or take in relatives, or make room for a crowd. You did not rearrange a house in that world. You rolled things up and put them against the wall. A room that slept 8 people could hold 40 standing, because there was almost nothing in it to move out of the way, which is exactly how a fishing family's front room came to be so full that 4 men had to go over the roof. There is one more kind of room worth mentioning, because it is where 2 of the most important scenes in the Gospels take place, and it belongs to a grander sort of house than anything in Capernaum. In a townhouse of some means, particularly in Jerusalem, a second story could be built over part of the ground floor, reached by its own outside stair, and used as a guest room. That is the large upper room, furnished and prepared, where the Last Supper is held, and it is almost certainly the upper room where the disciples are gathered afterwards. The detail that it is large and that it is furnished is doing quiet work in the text. It tells a first-century reader that this is a substantial house belonging to somebody with money, lent for the occasion. And an upper room with its own outside stair is also a room you can gather in privately, behind a door, without going through the household below, which is why a frightened group of people stayed in one for weeks. The architecture is not decoration in these passages. It is the reason the scenes could happen at all. There is one more detail in the story that only shows up when you compare 2 Gospels side by side, and it is one of my favorite small things in the New Testament, because it is the sound of a writer trying to be helpful. Mark, writing for an audience that knew this world, says they dug through the roof. Luke, a physician writing for readers who had never seen a mud roof in their lives, says they let him down through the tiling. Tiles. Fired clay roof tiles, laid overlapping on a timber frame, which is what a roof was if you lived in a Greek or Roman city anywhere around the Mediterranean. There were no tiles on that roof in Capernaum. The walls could not have carried them, and the archaeology of the village has not produced them. What Luke has done is translate, not the words, but the picture. He has taken a scene his readers could not visualize and rendered it in the building materials they knew, so that they would understand the essential thing. These men went up, they made a hole, they came down through it. I find that quietly moving rather than troubling. It is the mark of a writer who cares whether he is understood, working with an audience in a different climate, and a different building tradition, doing his best. And it is also, incidentally, a small piece of evidence that the accounts go back to something real. The version that does not fit a Roman roof is the older, harder to explain one, and it survived anyway. The houses shape other scenes too, once you have the pattern. Jairus, a ruler of the synagogue at Capernaum, came to ask the same favor for his daughter, and when the household is described later, there are flute players and a crowd of mourners already inside, which tells you both that he was a man of some standing and that even his house was small enough for that crowd to fill it. Martha of Bethany, who received him into a house she ran herself, is worrying about serving in a building of this kind. No separate kitchen, no dining room, cooking in the courtyard on a clay oven, and a room full of guests. Her frustration is not the frustration of a hostess with a large house and staff. It is the frustration of a woman doing everything herself, in the open, in front of everyone, while her sister sits down. And the crowd in Mark's very first chapter gathered at the door of the house at sunset until, as he puts it, all the city was gathered together at the door. That is a doorway a meter wide, opening onto a courtyard, opening onto a lane. A few dozen people would fill it completely. You do not need a large village to have a house entirely besieged. And then, in 1968, somebody dug up the floor. Capernaum had been identified, excavated in part, and argued over since the 19th century. The great white limestone synagogue that stands there, the one visitor's photograph, is a later building, 4th or 5th century, though it may well sit on the black basalt foundations of the one the Gospels mention. But a few dozen meters to the south, there was a different mound, with the ruins of an octagonal church on it, and underneath that, houses. Virgilio Corbo, the Franciscan archaeologist who began excavating Capernaum in 1968, worked there with Stanislaw Lofreder for years, and what they uncovered under the octagon was an ordinary insula of the kind we have been describing. Basalt walls, a shared courtyard, small rooms, the same fishhooks and lamps and cooking pots found in every other house in the village. Except for one room, which was not ordinary at all. Sometime in the middle of the 1st century, that single room was plastered, walls and floor, and all, which is not something anybody did to a domestic room in a Galilean fishing village. Plaster is a public finish or a religious one, and the ordinary household pottery in that room stops. What replaces it is storage jars and lamps, in numbers that make no sense for a family and perfect sense for a room where people gather. The room measured about 7 meters across, and over the following centuries, it was rebuilt and enlarged, given an arch to support a higher roof, and eventually enclosed within a 4th century structure with a walled compound around it. A building that archaeologists call a house church, a private dwelling adapted for congregational use. And then the writing. More than 100 inscriptions had been scratched into the plaster of that room, in Greek, in Aramaic, in Syriac, in Latin, layer over layer, by visitors across generations. They are mostly prayers and names and simple invocations of Christ. Whatever else that room was, it was a place people traveled to and left a mark in. Then, in the 5th century, they built an octagonal church, 8-sided, built directly over the room, and an octagon is not an ordinary church plan. In that period, it is the plan used to enshrine a specific holy place, built centered on the thing being commemorated. Whoever laid out that church was building around that room deliberately and centering on it exactly. Egeria, a pilgrim who traveled through Galilee in the early 380s, is the earliest surviving witness to what the place was understood to be. She was a woman of some means from the western edge of the empire, probably Spain or Gaul, and she wrote an account of her journey for the community of women at home, one of the most ordinary and most valuable documents to survive from the period. The account preserved from her journey says of Capernaum that the house of the Prince of the Apostles has been made into a church, with its original walls still standing. Two things in that sentence are worth holding. The first is that the site was already an established tradition by the 380s. The second is that whoever wrote it thought the original walls were still there, which is precisely what the excavators found underneath. Now, honesty about what that does and does not prove. It does not prove that Simon Peter lived in that room. There is no inscription that says so in the 1st century, and the identification rests on a chain of inference. An ordinary house, singled out and plastered within a generation of the events, visited and written on for centuries, and remembered as Peter's house by the 4th century at the latest. That chain is strong for archaeology and short of proof for a court. Which is the honest position, and I would rather say it plainly than overclaim, because the ordinary version is remarkable enough. Somebody, very early, marked out one small room in a fishing village and treated it as different, and kept doing so without a break for 300 years. The room they had crowded into was smaller than most modern living rooms, and if you stand in Capernaum today, you can see the outline of it. That is the correction that all of this has been building towards, and it is worth letting it land slowly. The whole of it would fit inside a modern double garage. That is the scale of the building where a crowd gathered until there was no room to receive them, not even about the door, not a hall, not a house with a courtyard you could hold a meeting in. A room and a yard and a doorway, and perhaps 40 or 50 people crammed into and around it, with more in the lane. Which brings us back to the 4 men and the hole they made, because now we can see what they actually did. They arrived carrying a friend who could not walk at a house they could not get into. They did not wait. They went up the outside stair, and going up an outside stair carrying a stretcher between 4 people is difficult and undignified, and everybody in the lane watched them do it. And then they knelt on somebody else's roof and started pulling it apart. Think about the mess falling into that room. Dry earth first, sifting down in a cloud onto the people below, then broken sticks and reed. Then daylight opening in the ceiling above a crowd of people who had come to listen to someone speak. It would have taken a while. It would have been impossible to ignore, and the teaching in the room simply stopped while it happened. They damaged property that was not theirs. They interrupted a rabbi in the middle of a sentence. They did it in front of the entire village, including, Mark is careful to tell us, scribes who had come from elsewhere and were sitting there watching. And they did it for a man who could not have asked them to and could not have carried himself an inch of the way. And the line that follows in Mark is the one I want to leave with you. When Jesus saw their faith, theirs, the 4 of them, up on the roof with dirt on their hands, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, thy sins be forgiven thee." The faith that gets commended in that story is not the sick man's. It is the faith of the people who carried him and would not be stopped by a door. There is a last thing to say, and it is the quietest, and then we can let the day go. Everything we have described tonight is small. A room of black stone, a roof of mud and branches, One clay lamp with a flame the size of a fingertip. A shared yard with an oven in it, a doorway you had to stoop through, a floor of beaten earth, and a family sleeping on mats in the dark with the animals breathing nearby. Nothing about it was distinguished. Thousands of houses exactly like it stood all over Galilee, and every one of them has fallen down. And that is where almost all of it happened. Not in the temple, not in a palace, not in a school, in houses. He healed in them, ate in them, slept in them, taught in them, was crowded in them until nobody could get through the door. The gospel moves from house to house across Galilee, room by small dark room. So the room you are lying in tonight is not a lesser place than the room in that story. It is the same kind of place. A roof over your head, a door that shuts, a light you can put out, and the ordinary quiet of a house at the end of a day. That is the setting God chose for most of the work. And if there is anything to carry into sleep from all of this, perhaps it is the 4 men. They did not have a solution, or standing, or a way in. What they had was a friend who could not get there on his own, and enough stubbornness to go over the top of the obstacle rather than give up in front of it. Whatever it is you cannot get through tonight, the door that will not open, the thing you have carried for someone else for longer than you expected to, the crowd of reasons standing between you and where you are trying to be, you are allowed to go up and over it. You do not have to be quiet about it. You do not have to be tidy about it. The men on that roof were neither, and the mess they made is the reason we still have the story. Sleep well, the roof will hold.